I guess let's start maybe, I'll start with you, Adam. Do you have your book handy?
I do, yeah.
Could you just read just a paragraph or two, not much, just enough so that someone who doesn't know your writing gets a little taste of how you write?
Yeah, thank you. I'll just read the first paragraph of the first story from my book. The title of the story is Pavam for a Dead Princess. I think of that time before everything got crazy, and I see Missy Ha like she was then, 19, with a heart-shaped face, teeth like fine china, and a little girl's giggle for something she knew that you didn't. Other girls tried so hard to make themselves look cute. Missy was pretty just because. And in that smile that stayed in her eyes, you thought you might see something better in yourself.
Thank you. And this is the advanced copy of the book I have here. But everyone, I forgot to mention in the spiel, I did forget one thing in the spiel, which is please buy copies of the books. You can do so, I believe, directly from the publisher. Yes, there's the link that just popped up in the chat window. So please, please, please buy a copy of the books that we're talking about tonight. They're both fantastic, and the best thing you can do for authors is buy and read their work. So one of the things that jumped out to me in this book right away, I mean, from what you just read, I think in that paragraph right at the beginning, is like, oh, we got voice here. So this is a really, the stories in the book are so voice driven. The voice is so well realized, and you have a real mastery of crafting voice, I think. Each story also has a unique language. They shift a little bit based on who the characters are, which is also a really hard thing to do, I think, for a writer. We tend to have our own voices in our heads, and it comes out on the page. And also that they have a shared language of place, because this is all set in Baltimore. So you have this shared language of place. So I was wondering how you craft voice and how you think about it. And sort of in particular, do you know the voice in your head before you start writing? Or how much do you discover as you write? Or how much do you come to in revision? What's sort of this process? Where does voice come from for you?
Right. Yeah, thank you. So, you know, like so many other things in fiction writing, voice for me kind of comes back to character. You know, so much of writing stories and writing fiction is about kind of inviting readers in and inviting readers in and giving readers access to character. And allowing them to identify with the character's perspective or desires or outlook. And so, you know, I think voice is a way to sort of carry that transaction off, is a way to give readers access to character and help readers get inside the character's head.
So you start with character then? Do you have this character before you start writing? Is the character the thing that forms your mind? Then you realize there's, maybe with the story, but is the character sort of like the generating force of stories for you?
I think so. I think that's generally true. You know, sometimes a conflict will, you know, often I'll think of a conflict, like something will occur to me, or maybe I'll see, you know, a kind of disagreement between people, sometimes at school, sometimes not at school. And so, you know, I'll kind of mess around with this idea of this conflict being the subject for a story. And often it doesn't go anywhere. And so it's not, so I say that just to say it's not just conflict that gets the stories kind of engined for me. It's got to be that voice piece too. It's got to be conflict plus, plus this voice that is so eager to tell this story, to share, you know, something that's happened where the stakes were high. Yeah.
How do you stay, because this is a broad swath of characters you're drawing from. So how do you stay respectful toward the voice that you maybe are borrowing from others that are, especially people who are living lives outside your personal experience, where you've been more of an observer than a participant?
Right. Yeah, so this comes up a lot for me, and I get asked this a lot. I've always thought about this question. I think about it more and more as the kind of intensity around these issues and intensity around identity politics grows. But, basically I have just a kind of handful of principles that I try and stick to. Um, obviously don't traffic in stereotypes, don't pathologize the urban poor, don't borrow from the pain or trauma of another group simply for your own gain or own benefit. Try and create rich, complex characters for whom race is but one strand in their identity. But I mean, your question's a good one. It's always something kind of hanging over my head. I'm very aware that I've created characters whose struggles cannot be disconnected from our country's vile, abominable history of racial injustice. So, that can actually begin to mess with my mind after a while and be sort of inhibiting. But I try and I try and put it aside.
I'll be honest. If I approaching a book, I might be worried if a white author is writing about non-white experiences, but I would think I would use your book after reading it as, okay, here's someone who did the work.
Mhm.
And I think I hear that phrase a lot too. If you do the work, and certainly you've put in the work. So I definitely think I didn't mean, I meant that as with respect. I thought you
Yeah,
had done the
thank you.
work necessarily to pull off what you pulled off. So
Thank you. I
congratulations on
appreciate you
that.
saying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Related to voice and tone is dialogue.
Hmm.
And I mean, I think anyone reading this book will also point to the dialogue because it just snaps. It's so tight and taut and wonderful, and at the same time naturalistic. It's like that hit that balance, which is so hard to hit. So, how do you see dialogue as discrete, as something that stands alone, or does a passage of speech relate to, on a language level, the prose around it?
Yeah. So, dialogue does a couple things for me. So, for one, I'm terribly afraid of readers feeling like they're getting bogged down and becoming uninterested. And so I know that, a scene of dialogue can really make a scene kind of move briskly. There's all that white space on the page, and it just kind of makes the narrative motor. Um, the other thing, the other reason I reach for dialogue is, there are a lot of writers that I read who are really good at rendering kind of psychological depth of characters. I'm thinking like Alice Munro, Edith Perlman, Bernard Malma. These are just a couple writers that pop into my mind where we come to know the characters in a really deep kind of emotional level where complex, unexpected emotions are being revealed. And so that is actually something that's hard for me to do. And I recognize this as a struggle for me to kind of render characters with psychological depth. It's something that I struggle with. And so one workaround for me is dialogue. There's nothing easy about writing fiction, but among the methods of characterization that I can reach for, writing a scene of dialogue is easier than others. And it comes a little more naturally to me.
Great. Yeah. So I'm going to do one more question before handing off to you, Emily, so you may be prepared for that eventuality. So related to all this, and I mentioned tone a little bit too, as opposed to voice, and they're obviously so closely related that I may be just interchanging synonyms.
Mhm.
But the main characters are all grappling with, I think, an idea of goodness in this book. They
Yeah.
all are on. Anyway, I won't go too much deep in that, but the circumstances push them beyond this goodness sometimes. But I'm always remained in a very sympathetic spot to these characters as a reader.
Yeah.
So how do you create a sympathetic tone? How do you not have a tone that judges them? And how do you create like relatable, lovable characters, even when they're forced into something like violence?
Right. Yeah. Thank you. So I'm a Baltimore City school teacher, and now in my 23rd year. So I've had a lot of days and weeks and months and years spending my days in classrooms with kids and getting to know them. So, you know, one of the things I often say when I talk about my work is that Baltimore is just, or can be, I don't want to generalize. I want to be careful not to generalize, but for a lot of kids growing up in Baltimore, it can be a place that's just really hard on them. And so I see a lot of kids go through that. I see a lot of kids navigating just a minefield of choices, none of which are easy. And I see how unforgiving their circumstances are of mistakes, the kinds of mistakes that any teenager might make, and that for kids at my school are not always easy to recover from. So I say all that to say that, you know, I like to think that the sympathy that you're noticing the characters being rendered with is that kind of mirrors the way I identify with some of the kids' struggles that I get to know at school. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, thank you. So Emily, let's turn to poetry for a set of questions. And thank you, Adam. We'll be back to you in a bit.
Yeah, that's great. I just wanted to add real quick to everyone here, if you have questions that come up, make sure to throw them in the chat because we'll loop back around and kind of, you know, address all of your questions. So just throw them in the chat and we'll get to those. But for now, we'll talk about the Understudy's Handbook, which is Steven's collection, and it is just a gorgeous, vibrant collection full of place and food and pop culture references. I mean, it's just full of so many things. So Steven, I wonder if you could read maybe one or two poems, and then maybe my starting question will change depending on what poems you read.
Thank you so much. I think I'm going to read a poem that was published in the Baltimore Review called How Our Sons Learn to Fight. How Our Sons Learn to Fight. The same chest-thumping tableau of two men disrobed and so close their fears thin to apple skin. We ain't hear nothing. Drum kit, we forget whose breath broke the silence. In the dark, can anyone tell one groan from another? The angels or Jacobs or the subwoofer praying hard to our knees, which fall and rise unrepentant to the parquet floor? The punch bowl gloriously shatters, slapped with strobe light. Our bodies remember our fathers saying, throw the first fist and buck. We remember we invented our father's advice about how to fight another man because we didn't know how to begin a love, only how to bruise the end. Maybe I'll read the opening poem, which is called Primer, and it's about the place where I was born. Primer. There's no New Orleans, only the pauses between parades. The city christens its own, each palm leaf brushing our esplanade a wet aspergillum. You will be known here as a gargoyle knows each inch of stone it sleeps in but cannot wipe its tears. What has all this iron wrought? Our family intoning Zydeco means the accordion's broken back, means another fiddle's whip over catgut, means there is a balcony for everyone to die on. What is French about these quarters is exile. All gardens to the backyard. Son, remember to tell your sons. What whispers in the weary ear endlessly, come here, taste, and taste is an inability to sustain innocence. No, not quite. Something like feathers plucked from a mask.
Great, thank you. Those are two really great poems to kind of give everyone a glimpse into the collection. So if you haven't purchased it yet, definitely purchase through the link in the chat. I heard rumors that it sold out at Politics and Prose. Is that correct? So that's
Yeah,
exciting.
yes. They all 5 copies that they ordered for their shelves.
Hey,
Yes.
that's good for poetry, right?
No, I was quite happy. I was quite happy.
Yeah, no, that's incredible. So there's a few places that we could start, but I think in hearing you read the poem, something that really stood out is just your attention to sound. And maybe this is kind of similar to the voice of the poems as well. Thinking about how Adam and Zach were talking about voice, but there's so much texture in the language of the poems. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about your process in crafting that, and changing it throughout the collection as you move from place to place and from subject to subject.
Sure. So the first thing I would say is that the euphony, right, that pleasurable sound of poems is the same thing as the sort of feel of a city. Okay, it's in the idiom, it's in the food, it's in the sensory experiences. It undergirds everything, and it's the thing that must be there that that precedes content, that precedes whatever the narrative is in the poem, that says to the reader, you can trust this journey we're about to go on. So I view sound and the pleasure making of sound as a way of engendering trust between the reader and I. But if I'm being a little bit more honest, I would say it's really like trust between me and the language itself. Like I mean, between the like actual poem. So I mean, I don't know that I can even begin a poem if I can't catch a kind of like, if I can't let my ear be curious, is another way to say it. And in that way, if I can capture the incantatory quality that is present in either speech or in playfulness in language, then I know that I can craft a spell that might be persuasive and convincing and might help you to see something a little more clearly. See a place, see a Baltimore, see a New Orleans, see a Houston, a little bit more clearly. So in some ways, sound is the first agent of clarity that I have, and so I begin with that.
Yeah, that's great. It's like the physical texture of the poem bringing out the texture of whatever narrative is there too.
Yeah, the example I sometimes tell my students is you don't have to understand a song in order to dance to it. Right? You're not like, you hear the opening lines of Billie Jean, you don't know what that song is about, but I bet you go to the dance floor, right? Based on that bass line. And I think that sort of thing is true for a poem as well.
Yeah, that's great. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the forms that you use in the book. There's a lot of sonnets and there's odes, there's some prose poems. So I wondered if you could talk about how you navigated which poems kind of fit into which form, and how you spread them throughout.
Sure. Yeah. You know, I sort of like stumbled into some of the sonnets because in some ways I had a bunch of poems when I was doing revisions that were like 13 lines, or some that were 15 lines, or some that were just always hovering around 14. And I don't know if that was just something unconscious that was happening. And that was a suggestion by one of the people that were giving me some feedback, is, hey, you've got all these poems that are just so close. And so late in the process, I went in and said, well, I'm just going to make some of these sonnets. And I thought of them in many ways kind of like Creole sonnets, in that they are synthesizing a lot of things and letting some other things go, you know? So they're speaking their French in a different way, they're speaking their English in a different way. Yeah, so some of it is both the argument that is within the structure of a sonnet, that you present something, you complicate it, the Volta turns it, and you resolve it in some kind of couplet or some kind of ending, felt appropriate for talking about what was lost in New Orleans through Katrina, and what in the way in which New Orleans didn't even really exist for people except for as this mythical idea. I think it's a city by which it is easy to mythologize because of its synthesis of bunches of cultures. To exoticize is another way to say it, right? And so it doesn't, it's as if it only exists in story, you know? And I felt like the sonnet, the structure of the sonnet felt kind of apt to kind of enter into some of that. But you know, I think in the way that I might imagine New Orleans as like this city of black magic, you know, I mean, African American magic or Caribbean magic or anything like that, you know, is therefore singing through the sonnet. Some of the odes that happen later are just about a kind of unabashed gratitude and unabashed praise of that which brings me joy, you know. So whether it's Lando Calrissian or it's, you know, taking my kids to the Baltimore Museum of Art, or if it's just Baltimore itself, you know. So I try to navigate both what is kind of reflective of a threshold of talking about the cities that I was navigating, and you know, uh, form is a kind of lingua franca. It's kind of trade language, right? So I tried to pay attention to what's being exchanged in those poems between the reader and myself and in the places I was writing about. And I tried to let the forms match up with some of those exchanges.
Yeah, it's interesting that you said you found some drafts that just seem to be hovering around sonnet length. I think I maybe work in a similar way where it feels like all of my drafts, I'm like, oh, 14 lines again. Like they just kind of come out in that length. And then it's up to that kind of revision process to either wrestle with the form or break it entirely.
Mm-hmm.
You brought up the Lando poem, and there's also a poem that references Star Trek, and there's some really great kind of music references as well that kind of build this experience for the various speakers in the poems. And I wonder if you could talk about how you, as you were putting the book together, kind of worked with these threads and worked your way through the sections of the book with those threads.
Sure. So there's a fair amount of like references to theater, like The Crucible by Arthur Miller, or to August Wilson, or to Star Trek, or to Star Wars. I mean, various things, right? And part of me, rather than thinking about how is somebody going to understand the pathway through all of this, I began at a place that said, you know, it's sort of a given that we synthesize these things within ourselves all the time. You know, we can read Faulkner and watch Real Housewives. You know, we you know, you might rail about memes on Twitter, but we still laugh at them, and then turn to Louise Gluck and read, you know, after my suffering there was a door. You know, like in other words, right? It is distinctly human to not to sort of contain all of those things at once without providing a kind of narrative structure that says this is why they deserve to be together. In other words, like I balance them on sort of like the crown of my head. You know, they're sort of balanced on my own obsessions. And so what my hope is that even if you are somehow not familiar with the reference isn't the point of the poem. The reference is simply the doorway I walked through to say something else, or to see something else. You know, that Lando poem, after like signifying, you know, in a bit and saying all these things, it ends with a question, a very simple question, right? Where, you know, if we asked you, Lando, where are all the black people in the galaxy, would you help us? You know, like that, you know, that is essentially I think a deep question about representation, about who we imagine to be in the future, right? And yet, in some ways, maybe the fact that I have to ask it to a fictional character and not to like the president, you know, says something about the way that I feel we're often made understudies. So yeah, I try to navigate it by sort of beginning with a place that if you're along for the ride, the synthesis will be something you discover on your own.
Yeah, that's great. And you brought up the idea of the understudy, which is from the title of the collection. And I know we've kind of talked a little bit offline about this, but I wonder if you could talk more about how it functions through the collection, about, parsing through things like identity and thinking of the book as a handbook of sorts, in relation to language and things like that.
Yeah. I think that I should before I get into that, I should just say, like, some of it in relationship to the title came out of my own background, thinking that I was going to be an actor as a profession, and that I was sort of curious and fascinated with that idea of a person whose purpose is to be well prepared for something that they're not actually going to do much of, or so you're prepared for a role but not allowed to play it. That idea, and so that began to be something that a kind of question that the book kind of returns to. What are the roles we're prepared for in society but not allowed to play? Roles of masculinity, roles of blackness, how blackness is performed but also authentic. Roles of gender, like and the way that places, like physical places, cities, are part and parcel. They're the stages by which we are, doing those rehearsals. I think it's so funny. So many people tried to get me to change the title of the book. So many folks, and I entertained many suggestions, and it was the one that I think just had the most duende, to use Lorca's term, right? It had the thing that made you most curious about what it was about. And for me, I'm like, if the title can't do that, if the title can't at least get you curious about what that might mean, it doesn't matter how well it matches the content, if you find it to be boring, right? So I'm not sure that I thought of the handbook, that idea of the understudy handbook, as something instructive, but almost more like these are things written in the marginalia, written in the margins of the scripts that we're given, in society. These poems might be like written in the margins of a great play, where the audience, here's a COVID reference, where the audience is absent. So that's a little bit about what I was thinking around the understudy.
Yeah. And now I'm curious about what those possible titles were. But that's okay. You don't have to share those. Yeah, Zach, I see you pop back in. Did we want to?
Yeah, I do have an audience question coming in for Adam, so I thought I'd plop that one in now. So you do a really great job at having an involved plot in your stories, while at the same time keeping the language literary, and making the reader care about the characters. It's this last one, creating an emotional engagement between the reader and the story, that is so hard to do and so elusive to pin down as an element of craft. Can you speak on how you're able to build that emotional pull? So this is maybe the hardest craft question I've ever heard. So how do you make emotional pull in fiction, Adam?
I don't know. No. Well, I mean, I should say that whenever I finish a story, I never know whether I'm going to be able to pull this off again. Actually complete a story that I can feel reasonably good about. I have all sorts of drafts that seem to end in loose ends. Trying to think about this. So I definitely, think about how to invite readers in and how to get them to stay and how to make them bring.
At Eastern time, the first results that would have been posted since about the 8:00 p.m. hour.
Sorry about that.
Okay. How to invite readers in, how to make the work evocative, how to make them stay, how to make them want to stay, how to make them feel involved in the character. You know, I guess some of that is giving characters struggles, and having things at stake for the character, and trying to get the reader on the character's side, even with all the characters' flaws and foibles.
Not to speak for you on this, but I do think in your writing in particular is you avoid the pitfall of trying too hard. You don't, like, there's big moments, but they're always personal moments. And I think that's maybe what one of the hallmarks of what is literary, quote unquote, is the ability to find that emotional pull in something when there's not a volcano erupting next to you or a plane crash. You have this moment, these smaller personal moments, and I think you navigate that so well. So
Yeah,
I
thank
think
you.
there's something about that too.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, maybe it's recognizing that in a small moment there is deep emotional content, and it's not just in the climaxes too. It's throughout. Like it's not just the final moment. It's this emotion is simmering and simmering and simmering. Maybe boils over in that moment. But anyway, I think I
Yeah,
agree with the question in terms
Yeah.
of the setup for the question.
yeah, thank you. I mean, one thing I might just add to this is that, you know, we all want the same things. You know, we want to feel safe. We want to feel loved. We want to feel heard. We want to feel valued. And, you know, these are sort of course, universal human desires. And, you know, so when you can get a character where some of those things are at risk, then maybe that creates emotional pull.
I mean, related to that was my next couple questions, which were sort of about scenic writing. And I really love scenic writing is one of my favorite things. And by that, I mean writing that happens basically in real time. You know, you're going moment by moment with characters. There's not a lot of, there's the ratio of summary and exposition to action, and action in the lowercase a sense,
Right.
is in favor of the action. And your stories tend to happen in these scenic moments. And there's characters think, there's references to previous moments that are relevant, but those are all revealed usually within the framework of a scene. And I think that might also be related to the idea of this emotional connection, is that we're not being told about things, we are experiencing the moment with the character. And so we have the same emotions that they might have.
Right.
So is this something you focus on intentionally? Or are you like, do you look at scene like, I need to, that's an exposition, I'm cutting that? Or do you just, is that just a natural byproduct of your reading and writing habits?
Yeah, thank you for that. No, I definitely look at the work and think I'm cutting that. So as I think I was mentioning before, you know, I'm terribly afraid of bogging readers down, and I really, you know, something I'm really kind of striving for is forward movement, narrative movement, like mobility in the narrative. So, you know, this makes me, of course, you need exposition sometimes, but it makes me terribly afraid of exposition. It makes me terribly afraid of backstory. You know, I do feel like in fiction, exposition, you know, can run the risk of sort of killing complexity, killing strangeness, killing mystery, killing interestingness. And so I do try and avoid it, and I do try and get rid of it when I can. You know, lots of writers have sort of talked about the same idea in different ways. You know, Aristotle said, "Say only what the story demands," and Poe talked about the unity of effect in a story, and Tobias Wolff says everything must be subordinated to the purposes of a story. So, you know, all those are ways of talking about the same idea, which is that, you know, narrative should be prized, is I think the idea. And that's something I believe in as a fiction writer. And
it is a stylistic choice too. I always wanted to like disclaim that that's not, it's been so common, and so much good writing uses that technique. But I think at the last craft chat I mentioned, Colson Whitehead's The Underground Railroad,
Mhm.
are the last 2/3 of that are exposition. There's like
Mhm.
one scene, the last 2/3 of that whole Pulitzer Prize, National Book Award winning book.
Mhm.
It's all told through, for one whole chapter, there's a character learning things while crouched in an attic. There's
Mhm.
literally no action because the character is stuck in that attic learning through a peephole, I believe. It's been a while since I read it, but so it's not like you can't write well in this other
Right.
form, but I can't do it. I can't do it. Colson Whitehead can maybe do it. I can't.
Right. Yeah, it's definitely an aesthetic choice. You know, I think of like stories by Catherine Mansfield, and you know, nothing much is happening except the exploration of like these very nuanced emotions, but it's very compelling.
I mean, Proust has like 7 volumes of this going on, so we have to.
Right.
So how, but you don't not have exposition and summary and backstory.
Mhm.
So what is the art of including those while keeping scene moving forward? Is it, how do you get those in there organically, smoothly, get the information you need, but still keep yourself in scene?
Yeah. I don't know. You got to find places to slip that stuff in and still hide the contrivance that you're telling a story. You know, you don't want the reader to see the writer's goals, and you want it to feel like it's organic to, like, you know, storytelling. So I don't know how I do it. I just I try and find spots to get it in there where, you know, it won't be or it won't be too obstructive to the narrative. You know, I'm in no way disparaging a form as venerable as the novel. I love novels. I read novels, but I'm drawn more to stories. And a lot of novels I pick up, you know, I get about halfway through, and it's hard for me to keep going. And part of the reason it gets hard for me to keep going is because I feel like I'm getting clobbered over the head with like backstory or exposition, or it's becoming a kind of vehicle for the author's ideas. So just, you know, for my personal aesthetic as a reader, you know, on the one hand, I love getting lost in the world of a novel, but, you know, exposition and backstory, too much of it in a novel, too much exploring, you know, a writer's kind of personal curiosities. If I feel like that's happening in a novel, that can make me close it too. Yeah.
I think it's almost like, just hearing you, like the word off my hand for short story writing in particular is that sleight of hand, that
Yeah.
you don't even notice I did this little trick of dropping you this little crumb of information you needed for everything else to make sense.
Right.
I snuck it in there, and that's maybe the skill, is like, how do you develop that skill to not reveal the trick to the reader so that it just happens and they don't even notice.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
All right, Emily, do you want to come back in and have some more questions?
Yeah, I wanted to kind of circle back to something we were talking about earlier with sound, and how that maybe was a primary concern for, you know, kind of jump starting the poems. And maybe if you could kind of walk us through your drafting process, your writing process of navigating. You know, if you start with sound, then kind of what follows, and how you kind of make your way through.
Okay. All right. So maybe I'll give an example that I shared yesterday from a poem that I really think is fantastic by Paul Celan, called Death Fugue. And Paul Celan is writing about the Holocaust, writing in German, but in translation, the opening of that poem, and I'm gonna paraphrase it a little bit, but it's like, black milk of daybreak, we drink you at sundown. Okay, we drink you at midday, we drink and we drink. There is such a evocative force to that, both in the image, but in translation, you can't help but get caught up in the sort of the kind of like pressure that the sounds are putting on that, right? So that's a single line, right? Like, black milk of daybreak, we drink you at. I mean, it's almost like you are being buried, right? And that fits the idea of the poem, in a kind of like 360 sound. And so when I'm, so I think about that a lot, right? Like, how can I capture half of that kind of presence? Because that's really what I'm talking about, is a kind of presence, right? Um, uh, in something, in the work. So there's a poem like that went through a lot of revisions called "Unmasking the Chorus," um, uh, uh, and I wrote a lot of versions of it, and something in that poem didn't unlock until I wrote a very simple sentence that begins like half of the first line, and it was simply "July doesn't beg." I was like, okay, I'm interested in the way that those three words exist sonically together. They end with a bit of a plosive in that B into that G, right? But the idea of it, so it was some of it was the sound of it. Then said, oh, that's an interesting idea. That a month would not beg, right? What does that mean? And then I realized, like, oh, that's a great way to talk about. Um, this, what ultimately is like the next image is about cicadas, right? About the kind of omnipresent sound of cicadas in July. The cicadas are coughing through their tymbals, I think, is what then comes next. But that used to be the first line. Cicadas are coughing through their tymbals. I was like, man, there's something nice about that. But when it wasn't until I got that something a little bit more evocative that I was like, okay, that's setting up a kind of thing that will pay off later in the poem. And that poem ends with like, I could die on this tree, the cicadas sing, coughing themselves rare and blue, like a husk of song, the lyrics, but not the tune. Like, so it was because of that initial push that I sort of arrived at something that I felt nice. So some of it is just, my process begins with training my ear to notice where, either in speech or in thought or or ear hustling, is a way of saying eavesdropping, or in reading, right, or just responding to other things, and sort of adapting them. So I'm always on the lookout for that sort of ineffable magic, right? So I begin with, I try to begin with that, and then let the ideas grow out of what I might be led to associatively, like that. Yeah, so some of my process, my process starts there, so that I never feel like I'm ahead of the poem. And if I do that, if I'm surprised by what is happening in the poem, then the reader has a greater chance of being surprised. And I have a less chance of being didactic. Because I don't want to, I don't think poets are sages. They're just ordinary folks. They just sing, in a different way, the way that a sculptor sings through clay. So
Yeah.
I mean, it's and I didn't mean to rhyme there, but hey, look, this is what's happening. And, so that's a little bit of the process. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. It's always interesting to hear how different poets kind of approach, what gets you writing on the page. But I think that's so true once you find that maybe that key to that one poem, that will bring it to a kind of a fully realized state. Then you're like, this was missing the whole time. Yeah. And
Yeah, I'm also just nerdy about language. Like, I love contronyms or auto antonyms, like any word like cleave, whose both, it's, that word has two meanings which are opposite one another. One means to do this, one means to cut in half, right? Bolt is the same way, right? There's how is it that we in English have these words that point in both directions? And so that feels very much like, oh my gosh, that's like our consternation around race embedded into language. So that I get kind of like geeky and nerdy about that too. So sometimes those can lead to poems as well.
Yeah. I mean, where else to get geeky about language than in a poem, right? I mean, when you're really at the fabric of one line or one word, that's the place where you have to do that. I'm just checking the chat. I don't see any questions. So if y'all have questions, please hit us with questions. Okay, I do see a question. Opinions on Derek Walcott.
Can I
I
ask
don't
for
know
a
who that is.
clarification? Are you asking me about his work, or are you asking about his personal life? Because I can talk all day about his I can talk all day about his work.
His work is
okay. Because otherwise I would have to, start by saying I didn't know the man. I think his work has had a big influence on me. A huge influence. I think he's got a wonderful poem called Sea Grapes that ends with a line, the classics can console, but not enough. And I think, oh my God, what a maxim for poets, to say that we always need new poems, right? Why do we always need new poems? Because the classics can console, but not enough, And so, yeah, I mean, I think he is a genius, I think his work is his early work is so influenced by Robert Lowell, but it is at its heart doing, I think, many of the things that I am trying to do. He does it for St. Lucia, and that idea of like Creolite that comes from Glissant, about, thinking about how we make what history makes of us and what language makes of us, through synthesis. And for me, that felt very similar to New Orleans. So, I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, it's just, I am often in awe of his work, and just his breadth, his longevity, So yeah, I mean, he's a muse in many ways, that I return to.
And this kind of leads me into one of the questions that we wrap up with sometimes, but I'm just wondering, what kind of craft advice do you turn to for yourself, or are there poets that you find yourself returning to again and again in terms of like a craft level that you find really influence your work?
There are many, so I'll try not to bore you with a long list. I think somebody like Carolyn Forche. I think about her famous prose poem, "The Colonel." And there are many like just fantastic images in there, but there are two moments in that poem that are so deceptively simple. One of them is the way it begins. What you have heard is true. Like, I mean, that could be the start of a novel or a short story or anything, right? Like, there's something she just nails that so well. And then there's another moment in there where in the middle of the poem in The Colonel, she says, "There's no other way to say this." And you really have to earn whatever comes after that. Like there's something you had better be coming with something that is just gonna blow the top of your head off, like Emily Dixon says. So I return to her work quite a bit. And interestingly, that line shows up, that same line, "There's no other way to say this," is in a Yusuf Komunyakaa poem called "You Never Know," in which he says, "There's no other way to say this, I fell in love." Like, I mean, he's talking about finding a dead body in Vietnam and turning it over and finding a image, a photograph of that man's family in his pocket, and I mean, it's, so I return to Komunyakaa, I return to Carolyn Forche, to the poet AI, Japanese and Native American and Black poet. who writes these fantastic persona poems. But then certainly folks like Tim Seibles and Terrence Hayes, contemporary poets that I think, I'm trying to capture some of their swagger, and the language. But then, I mean, I really love the work of Ilya Kaminsky. I think, his Dancing in Odessa, I think, was a revelation for me and for my work. And it made me appreciate what Mendelssohn was doing, and Kaminsky's great love for Mendelssohn and Brodsky and Tsetaeva and all of these modernist Russian poets kind of brought me into those things as well. So I guess I would wrap that up by saying I'm always interested in the poets who continually open me up, and open me up to what is possible in the poem. And, I find that to be a lot of that my influences end up being pretty broad.
Yeah. Well, everyone has a lot of names for their reading list now, so that's great. And Zach, I don't know, did you want to loop back up? I see Caroline has a question about place in the work, and maybe this is for both.
Yeah, I was thinking maybe we could ask that to both of them, and
Yeah.
that would be a good way to conclude. Because Baltimore does, place in general, Baltimore specifically, does play a large part. So how does place, Baltimore and specifically, and then I think, Stephen, you have some outside of Baltimore that happen too, but how does place define your work? And do you write about other places, maybe more broadly, other places other than you've lived as well? So Adam, you want to go first since you've been sitting for a while? You're muted, Adam.
Not anymore. Thank you. Yeah, so all the stories in my book take place in Baltimore, and they're all about kids coming of age in Baltimore. So, as I think I was sort of getting at before, my experience of getting to know kids in my classroom has, it's given me a glimpse of a Baltimore that I otherwise would not have known. This is one of the strange, kind of wondrous miracles of the classroom, is that when it's going right, it kind of melts away all these barriers that are often up otherwise. So barriers around race or class or so all the stories are set in Baltimore, and they this part of Baltimore that is so hard on some children growing up there, that's a big part of my book. That's a big part of these stories. And I hope the stories honor the goodwill and generosity and strength and determination that I've come to see in so many kids at school as they work through these struggles that are really part and parcel of some parts of the city.
Yeah, I think for me, what I would say is place is our first poetics. All right. So like in Louisiana, the word store, right, and the word flow rhyme, stow and flow. All right. But they won't rhyme in another place, so that is something that I'm constantly thinking about, is the way in which place informs language. And then poems are made of language, right? So, but I also think that, I think if we imagine places, right, we can also imagine things. We can, if we can use our imaginations to let place be transformative, then we don't simply hold a mirror to the world, up to the world, but we recreate the world. And so, like, that's why, like, in the book, I could have a poem where the main character from the Count of Monte Cristo, Edmond Dantes, can speak to Freddie Gray, right? Two people who have experienced grave injustice, you know, are sort of like sharing a drink in the afterlife, right? So to that question, do I write about other places? Sure. Sometimes there are places that don't exist yet, or conversations or spaces that don't exist yet. And I think that's important work for literature as well.
All right, well, I think that's going to wrap us for the evening. Adam, Steven, thank you so much. Emily.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us here. It's been wonderful.
And
Likewise.
please buy the
Buy
books.
the
Find them
books.
on Writers, Washington Writers Publishing House, and it's going to be worth your time to look those up and get yourself a copy. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Right.